What if everyone is you? Part of the thinking library. The What If series, Volume 5. Introduction. The stranger is not a stranger. What if the person sitting across from you isn't truly separate? Not in the casual, poetic sense we sometimes use when we say we're all connected. Not as a metaphor to make us feel better on difficult days, but in a way that is literal, unsettling, and quietly transformative. What if they are you? Not the version of you you recognize. The one with your name, your memories, your personal history, but another expression of the same awareness. Another vantage point. Another life unfolding through a different lens. We move through the world with a deep assumption we rarely question, that consciousness is divided, that it lives inside bodies like water inside separate bottles. Yours is yours. Mine is mine. Everyone else is other. But what if that division is not as real as it feels? Because when you look closely, something strange begins to emerge. Every person you meet experiences life from the center of their own perspective. Just like you do. They feel like the main character of their story. Their thoughts are private. Their emotions are immediate. Their existence feels central, not secondary. And from their point of view, you are the other. So where, exactly, is the true center of consciousness? Is it duplicated billions of times? Or is it something more unified? Something that appears separate only because it is expressed through different bodies, different histories, different identities? Imagine for a moment that consciousness is not something you have, but something you are part of, like a vast field rather than a collection of isolated points. And each person is a kind of opening in that field. A place where awareness looks out and says, I am here. If that were true, then every interaction you've ever had takes on a completely different meaning. The stranger you pass on the street is not entirely unknown. The friend who understands you is not entirely separate. Even the person who frustrates or hurts you is not entirely other. They are another angle of the same underlying awareness. This idea doesn't erase individuality. It doesn't deny that people have different personalities, beliefs, or choices. Those differences still matter. They shape how life unfolds in each form. But beneath those differences, beneath language, culture, memory, and identity, there may be something shared, something constant, something that does not belong to one person more than another. And if that's even partially true, then the way we relate to others begins to change. Because suddenly, kindness is no longer just a social virtue. It becomes a kind of internal harmony. And harm, it no longer lands out there. It reverberates within the same field it came from. The stranger is not a stranger. Not completely. They are a version of you you do not yet recognize. A life you are not currently living. A perspective you have not yet stepped into. And maybe the real question is not whether this idea is true in some absolute sense. Maybe the real question is this. If the person in front of you were, in some deep and hidden way, another expression of you, how would you treat them? Chapter 1. Many Faces, One Awareness. We tend to think of consciousness as something personal, something contained, something that begins with me and ends where you begin. It feels obvious, almost unquestionable. You have your thoughts. I have mine. You experience your life from the inside, and I experience mine from a place you can never fully enter. There is a boundary, clear, invisible, but firm. Or at least it feels that way. But what if that feeling is not the full picture? Consider this. Every person you encounter moves through the world with the same quiet certainty you do. They feel like the center of their own experience. Their thoughts arise unannounced. Their emotions feel immediate and real. Their sense of I is just as strong, just as undeniable as yours. From where you stand, they are one among many. From where they stand, you are one among many. So again, the question returns, where is the true center? If everyone experiences themselves as the center, are there billions of centers? Or is there something deeper that only appears divided? Imagine standing in a room filled with mirrors. In each mirror, the same person is reflected, but from slightly different angles. Some reflections are clearer, others distorted. Some are bright, others dim. But all of them point back to a single source. Now imagine replacing the mirrors with people. Each person becomes a kind of lens, shaped by biology, culture, memory, and experience, through which awareness expresses itself. The differences are real. They matter. They define how each life unfolds. But the awareness itself? It may not be as separate as it seems. This is where the idea begins to stretch the way we normally think. Because if awareness is more like a field than a collection of isolated units, then individuality doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes expression rather than ownership. You are not a container of consciousness. You are a channel of it. And so is everyone else. That would mean the voice in your head, the one that says, I, is not exclusive to you. It is the same fundamental sense of being, appearing through a different configuration. Not identical in content, of course. Your memories are yours. Your story is yours. Your personality carries its own distinct shape. But the fact of being aware, the simple experience of existing, of perceiving, of knowing that you are here, that may be shared. One awareness, many faces. And if that's even slightly true, it begins to blur the edges we rely on so heavily. The line between self and other softens. Not completely, not in a way that erases difference, but enough to raise a quiet question beneath every interaction. Am I meeting someone else, or encountering another expression of the same underlying awareness? You don't have to answer it immediately. In fact, it might be better if you don't. Just notice what happens when you hold the possibility. When you look at someone, not as a separate center of consciousness entirely cut off from you, but as another window through which the same light might be shining. Something subtle begins to change, not in the world around you, but in how you see it. And sometimes, that's where everything begins. Chapter 2. Kindness becomes logical. If everyone is, in some deep sense, another expression of the same awareness, then kindness stops being a moral rule handed down from outside. It becomes practical, almost inevitable, because the moment you begin to see others not as completely separate, but as extensions, different angles of the same underlying field, your actions start to loop back in a new way. What you do doesn't just travel outward. It returns, not through some mystical system of reward and punishment, but through the simple fact of shared being. Hurting someone, then, is no longer a clean, one-directional act. It becomes complicated, like your right hand striking your left. The impact may appear localized, but the experience belongs to the same body. The same system registers both the action and the pain. The division is functional, not absolute. And suddenly, harm starts to look inefficient. Not because you've been told it's wrong, but because it no longer makes sense. The same is true for kindness. Kindness stops being a performance. It's no longer about appearing good, or following social expectations, or earning approval. It becomes a form of internal coherence, a way of aligning with the deeper structure of reality. If that structure is, in fact, shared, you don't help someone because you're supposed to. You help because, at some level, you recognize yourself there. This doesn't mean every act becomes easy. There are still moments of frustration. People will still misunderstand you, disappoint you, push against your limits. Emotions don't disappear just because your perspective expands. You still feel anger, irritation, even resentment. But those feelings begin to move differently. They don't settle as easily into hatred, because hatred depends on distance. It needs a clear sense of that person is not me. And once that line starts to blur, even slightly, hatred loses some of its footing. In its place, something quieter begins to emerge. A question, not, how do I win this interaction? But, what response reduces unnecessary harm within the whole? And sometimes, that answer is still firm. Sometimes kindness looks like boundaries. It looks like saying no. It looks like stepping away from situations that distort or damage. Kindness, in this sense, is not softness. It's clarity. It's the recognition that preserving well-being, yours and others, is not a trade-off. It's the same movement, seen from different sides. There's also a shift in how you interpret other people's behavior. When someone acts out of anger or fear, you don't immediately reduce them to a bad person. Instead, you begin to wonder what conditions, what experiences, what internal pressures might have shaped that moment. Not to excuse it, but to understand it. Because if you had lived their exact life, felt what they felt, learned what they learned, carried what they carried, would you be entirely different? Or would you, in some quiet and uncomfortable way, arrive at the same place? This question doesn't weaken responsibility. It deepens it. Because now, responsibility is not just about controlling your actions. It's about participating consciously in a shared field of experience. Every word, every gesture, every choice contributes to the tone of that field. And kindness, it becomes less about being good and more about being aligned with the simple, grounding truth. What you give, you are, in some form, also receiving. Chapter 3. Conflict as internal friction. If everyone is, in some deep sense, another expression of the same awareness, then conflict becomes harder to simplify. Not because it disappears, but because it becomes more revealing. We're used to thinking of conflict as something that happens between separate sides. Me versus you. Right versus wrong. My position against yours. There's a kind of clarity in that framing. It gives us roles. It gives us certainty. It gives us someone to blame. But if the boundary between self and other is not as absolute as it feels, then conflict starts to look different. It starts to look internal. Not personal, exactly, but interconnected. Like tension within a single system that doesn't realize it's one system. Think of your own body for a moment. If your hand touches a hot surface, your nervous system doesn't argue about whose fault it is. It responds. It adjusts. It learns. There's no division between the part that caused the pain and the part that felt it. Both belong to the same organism. Now stretch that idea outward. What if human conflict, arguments, betrayals, misunderstandings, is something like that? Not identical, but similar in structure. A kind of friction that arises when different expressions of the same awareness collide without recognizing their connection. This doesn't make conflict meaningless. If anything, it makes it more important. Because now, conflict isn't just something to win or avoid. It becomes something to understand. A signal, a moment where something within the larger field is out of alignment. That changes how you respond. You can still disagree. You can still stand your ground. You can still say, "This is not acceptable," or "I will not allow this." Boundaries don't vanish under this perspective. They become more intentional. But what begins to fade is the impulse to dehumanize. It becomes harder to reduce someone to a label, to flatten them into enemy, when you're holding, even faintly, the possibility that they are another expression of the same underlying awareness. You start to see behavior in layers. On the surface, actions, words, reactions. Underneath, fear, conditioning, past experiences, unmet needs. And deeper still, the same basic awareness, looking out from a different set of circumstances. This doesn't excuse harm, but it reframes how you carry it. Instead of holding on to conflict as something external, something they did to you, it becomes something you engage with more carefully, something you process, not just react to. There's also a shift in how long conflict lives inside you. When you see others as entirely separate, resentment can linger. It hardens. It becomes part of your identity. I am the one who was wronged. The story loops over and over. But when separation softens, even slightly, something else becomes possible. You begin to ask, what is being revealed here? What is this moment showing me? About them, about me, about the space we both exist in? And sometimes, that question loosens the grip. Not instantly, not completely, but enough to create space. Space where reaction could have been automatic. Space where understanding might enter. In this way, conflict stops being just a clash between two sides. It becomes a point of contact, a place where awareness meets itself, imperfectly, sometimes painfully, but with the potential to recognize, even briefly, that it was never truly divided to begin with. Chapter 4. The End of Loneliness. Loneliness feels absolute when you're inside it. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for logic. It arrives quietly, sometimes even in a crowded room, and tells you something that feels undeniably true. You are on your own. No one fully understands you. No one sees exactly what you see, feels what you feel, carries what you carry. There is a gap between you and everyone else, and no matter how close you get, that gap never completely disappears. That's the experience. But what if the interpretation is incomplete? Because loneliness depends on a certain assumption, that consciousness is separate, that each person is sealed within their own inner world, unreachable in any real sense. You can communicate, you can connect, you can share moments, but ultimately, you are alone inside your own awareness. Now imagine that assumption softening, not disappearing completely, but loosening just enough to let another possibility in. What if the awareness looking through your eyes is not entirely different from the awareness looking through someone else's? What if the sense of I am, the simple, undeniable feeling of being present, is not owned by you, but expressed through you? If that were even partially true, then loneliness begins to shift. Because the problem is no longer that you are alone in existence. The problem becomes that you are experiencing yourself as separate within something that is not entirely separate. And that's a very different kind of loneliness. It's less like being stranded, and more like being disconnected from something you are already part of. You start to notice small things. The way a stranger laughs, and for a moment, it feels familiar. The way someone explains their pain, and something in you quietly says, I know that feeling. The way a conversation flows, and it no longer feels like two isolated people exchanging words, but something shared unfolding between you. These moments don't erase loneliness, but they interrupt it. They introduce doubt into the certainty of separation. And sometimes that's enough, because loneliness often grows in the space where we feel unseen, unrecognized, unreflected. It tells us that our experience is uniquely ours, and therefore, no one can truly meet us there. But if awareness itself is shared, if the same fundamental presence exists behind every face, then maybe being seen is not as rare as it feels. Maybe it's happening more often than we realize. Not always through words, not always through deep conversations, but through something quieter, a glance, a pause, a moment of genuine attention. It doesn't solve everything. There will still be days when you feel distant, misunderstood, cut off from the world around you. This perspective doesn't magically remove those experiences, but it changes what they mean. Instead of saying, I am completely alone, you begin to wonder, am I failing to recognize myself and others right now? That question doesn't force connection. It opens the possibility of it. And sometimes, that's enough to soften the edges of loneliness. Because if you are not truly separate, if you are part of something that is expressing itself in many forms, then connection is not something you have to create from nothing. It's something you begin to notice, something that was already there, waiting quietly beneath the surface of every interaction, waiting to be recognized. Chapter 5. Living as if it's true. You don't have to prove this idea. You don't have to fully believe it, defend it, or build your identity around it. But something begins to shift when you start living as if it might be true. Not constantly, not perfectly, just intentionally, from time to time, as a quiet experiment. Because ideas like this don't stay in thought. They shape attention, how you notice, how you respond, how you move through ordinary moments. You're in a conversation, and instead of waiting for your turn to speak, you pause. You listen, not just to the words, but to the presence behind them. The fact that there is awareness there, interpreting, feeling, experiencing, just as you are. And something subtle changes. You're no longer just exchanging information. You're encountering something that may not be entirely separate from you. Or someone cuts you off, speaks sharply, behaves in a way that would usually trigger an instant reaction. You feel it rise, fast, familiar. But just before it takes over, another thought appears. What if this is me, in a different set of conditions? That question doesn't excuse the behavior. It doesn't mean you tolerate harm or abandon your boundaries. But it creates space. And in that space, your response becomes a choice instead of a reflex. Sometimes you still react. But sometimes you respond differently. More measured, more aware, less driven by defense, and more guided by understanding. Over time, those moments add up. You begin to notice patterns. How quickly judgment forms when you assume separation. How easily it softens when you consider connection. How your tone shifts when it feels like you're speaking to yourself, not at someone else. Even your internal dialogue begins to change. Because if awareness is shared, then how you treat yourself isn't separate from how you treat others. Self-criticism becomes another form of harm within the same field. And self-compassion becomes just as essential as compassion for anyone else. This way of seeing also brings a quiet responsibility. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just steady. You begin to recognize that every interaction contributes to the tone of the space you exist in. Every word, every reaction leaves an imprint. And if that space is shared, if everything unfolds within one broader field of awareness, then how you show up matters. Not because you control everything, but because you are always participating in something larger than yourself. Living this way doesn't make you passive. It doesn't make you naive. If anything, it sharpens you. You still set boundaries. You still make decisions. You still walk away when necessary. But beneath those actions, there is less hostility, less need to divide the world into me versus them, and more curiosity, more care, more intention. You move through life with a quiet question in the background. If this is all connected, how do I want to show up within it? That question doesn't demand perfection. It simply asks you to notice, to pay attention, and when you can, to choose a response that reflects the possibility that you are not separate, not alone, but present everywhere. Conclusion: you everywhere. So what if everyone is you? Not in the obvious ways, not in personality, not in memory, not in identity. Those differences are real. They shape every conversation, every decision, every life path. You are still you, in the way you've always understood it. But what if, beneath all of that, there is something shared? Something that doesn't belong to one person more than another. Something that isn't divided, even though it appears in many forms. Something quiet, constant, and strangely familiar, the simple fact of being aware. If that's true, even in part, then the world you move through is not what it first appears to be. It's not a collection of separate lives brushing against each other by chance. It's something more intimate, more interconnected, more reflective. Every interaction becomes layered. On the surface, it's just two people talking, two perspectives meeting, sometimes aligning, sometimes clashing. But underneath, there may be something else happening. Awareness encountering itself. Not always gracefully, not always kindly, sometimes with confusion, sometimes with tension, sometimes with pain, but still within the same field. And if you begin to see the world this way, even occasionally, something subtle begins to change. You stop moving through life as if everything is out there. You start to feel a quiet continuity between what you do and what you experience. The line between action and consequence becomes less distant. Because if the person in front of you is not entirely separate, then your actions don't just leave you. They stay within the same space you exist in. They shape it. That doesn't mean every moment becomes peaceful. It doesn't mean conflict disappears or that you suddenly understand everyone. There will still be misunderstanding. There will still be frustration. There will still be moments when the idea of connection feels far away. But even then, something lingers. A possibility that beneath the noise, beneath the differences, beneath the stories we carry about who we are and who others are, there is a shared presence. And when you remember that, even briefly, it influences how you respond. You pause more. You listen differently. You choose your words with a little more care. Not because you're trying to be perfect, but because something in you recognizes that nothing you do is truly isolated. It all lands somewhere. And that somewhere may not be as far from you as you once thought. In this way, the question is no longer about proving whether this idea is ultimately true. It becomes something more personal, more immediate, more practical. How do you want to live, if this might be the case? How do you want to treat the people you meet, the ones you love, the ones you struggle with, the ones you may never fully understand? If they are, in some deep and hidden way, not entirely separate from you. What kind of world are you creating through your interactions? Because if this perspective holds even a fragment of truth, then every moment is an opportunity. Not to control everything, not to get everything right, but to participate consciously in something shared, to respond with a little more awareness, a little more care, a little more intention. And maybe that's where it all leads. Not to certainty, but to a simple, steady realization. You are not just in the world. You are everywhere within it.